Harvard University, the school that has produced 22 Supreme Court justices, more than Yale and Columbia combined, and 3 of our students didn't even graduate law school and still went on to the Supreme Court. We're that awesome. It's with great pride that we announce the continuation of our ongoing academic tradition of excellence in the form of Professor Lahore Vajistan's classes on RuPaul's Drag Race and queer ethnography. That's right, Professor Lahore Vajistan will be teaching at Harvard this coming year, after authoring the triumphant books Decolonizer Drag and Ish Style, Accenting Gay Indian Nightlife. We just got $2.4 billion in taxpayer-funded aid unfrozen from the federal government under Donald Trump. Harvard. Because fuck you, that's why. We do whatever the hell we want.
It's funny because it's true. It's funny because it's true. It's funny because it's true.
And welcome to IRA, episode 108, our live stream on gender and sex absurdity and its origins. We thank all of our regular viewers, all 8 or so of them. We just started streaming about a minute and a half, 2 minutes ago. So today's episode is going to focus largely on child rape in a cultural context, as well as the gender and sex identity confusion that has dominated the opening 25 years of this century. And so as we take a look at this, as we take a look at the 21st century in that context, we're going to draw on some obscure sources, and we're going to make some assertions here by using the words of leftists against them and people who advocate for extreme gender or extreme sexual orientation ideology. We're going to be highlighting their words from their source text, and we're going to be putting things like child rape in a cultural context as a result of this. And so what I would say to you is, as we go forward with this episode, many of you are going to have a bit of cognitive dissonance, and I want to, issue a disclaimer up front, which is that is perfectly normal, because just about everything that we've been taught in the Christian evangelical right is wrong. And we're going to get into that in depth in the first part of this episode. Later tonight, I'll come back with the second part of the episode. But I felt it necessary to break this up into 2 episodes because of the sheer amount of source material that we have to go through. And so what I want to do is bring up our first section, which is part 2 of this episode after this introduction. And I want to highlight the absurdity and where it originates culturally. And in doing so, open your eyes to the oxymoronic concept of a Christian Zionist, or even a Jewish Zionist. And so consequently, we're going to pull up the slide that exemplifies our first part of this episode, or the second part of this episode after the introduction, and that is child rape in a cultural context. And so as we begin this, I want you to understand what we're working with here. We are working with explicit, verbatim quotes from the Talmud. And I want you to take a look at that in that context. I want you to see how child rape became normalized or more accepted in a cultural context and where that originated. And so here we go. let's take a look at our first slide, which comes from the Babylonian Talmud, which you can access on Sepharia, that is Sepharia, Sepharia, which has a lot of Jewish text on it. But this is Niddah 44a. Let's pull that up real quickly. So, this is Niddah 44, B verses 9. The Mishnah here this is a basic rule. A girl who is 3 years and 1 day old, whose father arranged for her betrothal, is betrothed through intercourse, as the halakhic or legal status of intercourse with her is that of intercourse in all halakhic or legal senses. In the case where the childless husband of a girl 3 years and 1 day old dies, if his brother, the Yavam, engages in intercourse with her, he acquires her as his wife. And if she is married, a man other than her husband is liable for engaging in intercourse with her due to violation of the prohibition against intercourse with a married woman. So here we have the Talmud teaching that a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old is perfectly capable of betrothal through intercourse, through sex. And so this is what is being normalized. This is the rabbinical teaching or interpretation of the religious law of Judaism. That if you're 3 years and 1 day old and a girl, you can be betrothed through intercourse. It's perfectly permissible. You can have sex with a 3 year and 1 day old girl. That's the level of what we're dealing with, which in the Western world today would be known as pedophilia. As a practical matter, you can imagine how horrible life must have been for any 3-year-old girl subjected to the Talmudic rule, which is at 3 years and 1 day old, she could have sex. She could be betrothed through marriage or through sex into marriage with a man much older than her. So that gives you an insight into what the cultural norms and the sexual norms of the people who existed under rabbinical law, under rabbinical teaching in the Talmud, gives you an insight into their life and their cultural norms. It's going to get much more explicit than that. I want to caution you as we go forward. So, as we go on to Niddah 45a9, they're talking about a Gentile woman named Justini, who is the daughter of Asverius, the son of Antinous, a Roman emperor. She comes before Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, and she asks him, "My teacher, at what age is a woman fit to marry? At what age is it appropriate for a woman to engage in intercourse, which would therefore be the appropriate time to marry?" And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to her, "She must be at least 3 years and 1 day old." So one of the things that Zionist apologists and Talmudic apologists do is they try to say that this is just a rabbinical dialogue over certain day-to-day issues. It doesn't necessarily mean that the Talmud is condoning marriage between an adult and a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old. However, if you read the full passage, Niddah 44a and Niddah 45a, you're going to see that that is absolutely untrue. At no point does the Talmud repudiate sex with a 3-year-old and 1 day old girl. It doesn't. In fact, it gets much worse. It says that if someone has sex with a girl who is even younger than that, while you cannot be betrothed through marriage to her, it's akin to poking a finger in the eye. It's not that big of a deal to have sexual intercourse with a girl who's older than 3 years and 1 day, or a girl who's younger than 3 years and 1 day old. This is what we're dealing with here. Now, as we get into the next slide, Justini further inquired, at what age is she fit to become pregnant? The rabbi said to her when she is at least 12 years old, and 12 years and 1 day old. She said to him, I married when I was 6 and gave birth a year later when I was 7. Woe for those 3 years between the age of 3 when I was fit for intercourse and the age of 6 when I married, as I wasted those years in my father's house by not engaging in intercourse. When you read it the first time, you don't have any words for what you're reading. You understand that this is something that was normalized in the culture thousands of years ago. It still, as a human being, really takes your breath out of your chest. I mean, it just stuns you that anyone would believe in this and would practice it, that anyone would be able to be sexually attracted to a 3-year and 1-day-old child. But the Talmud is rooted in real-world experiences and the application of Jewish law, the 613 mitzvahs, to those situations. And it is very clear in the Talmud, in Niddah 44a and Niddah 45a, that it is perfectly permissible in Jewish culture at that time and even later to have sex with a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old. Now, the Talmud does say that it's not appropriate, a girl is not fit to be pregnant until she is 12 years and 1 day old. And biologically, that's true. She isn't menstruating. She can't get pregnant earlier. But according to this Gentile cited in this instance, Justini, she was married at 6 and she gave birth a year later when she was 7. If you can imagine that. Now, the passage goes on to say that Justini may have been lying because she was a Gentile, and Gentiles lie, and their flesh is the flesh of donkeys. There's that passage, that dehumanizing passage in Ezekiel. And as we get into the next two video excerpts, first off, I want to present to you a TED Talk on pedophiles. That is, someone who is attracted sexually to a prepubescent child. And I want you to pay close attention as to how the speaker in this instance attempts to normalize this kind of attraction.
Suppose a man says, I view animated child porn. So there's no real victim in that sense of child pornography, which we both agree is horrendous. And by viewing animated child porn, it prevents me from acting out sexually on a child. Now, I deny that. I think that pornography inflames us to then want to act those fantasies out, and I think there's good studies that back that up. But surely you wouldn't say to the man who views animated child pornography, that's not bad so long as you don't act it out. Wouldn't you want to help this poor sick dude?
Yes, I would, but I'm thrilled that he's not acting it out. I mean,
agreed.
Okay,
of course.
Well, that's big.
Yeah.
We're both thrilled that he might have a poor substitute, but it is a substitute if that were the case. No child is being used. Yeah. It's all animated.
Yeah.
And he
but would you use the word
I want you to pay attention to what just happened here. Now, Dennis Prager was offered the chance to condemn the production of AI cartoons depicting child sexual abuse as evil, and he wouldn't do it. There's a fundamental gulf between Jewish values and Gentile values on this, in which even the depiction of this kind of behavior is seen as abominable among Gentiles, among non-Jews, and the depiction is not seen as abominable or problematic among Jewish thinkers or Jewish influencers. So that's what we're dealing with here. It is a fundamental cultural gulf or bifurcation in values between the two camps, and it traces back to those beliefs in which you could absolutely engage in this kind of behavior with a child in the Talmud who is 3 years and 1 day old, and you're betrothed to her by intercourse, as it were. So, as we get further into this episode, you're going to see more and more instances of this. You're going to see more and more instances of these kinds of beliefs and these kinds of values and the thinking that underlies them.
Suppose a man says, I view animated child porn. So there's no real victim in that sense of child pornography, which we both agree is horrendous. And by viewing animated child porn, it prevents me from acting out sexually on a child. Now, I deny that. I think that pornography inflames us to then want to act those fantasies out, and I think there's good studies that back that up. But surely you wouldn't say to the man who views animated child pornography, that's not bad so long as you don't act it out. Wouldn't you want to help this poor sick dude?
Yes, I would, but I'm thrilled that he's not acting it out. I mean,
agreed.
Okay,
of course.
Well, that's big.
Yeah.
We're both thrilled that he might have a poor substitute, but it is a substitute if that were the case. No child is being used. Yeah. It's all animated.
Yeah.
And he.
But would you use the word evil of animated child pornography? Because I certainly would.
No, I would use evil only with behavior. That's where we might differ. Yeah. Forgetting the sex issue, you can't be evil. You didn't do evil if you thought evil. You did evil
if I'm
if you committed.
masturbating to animated pictures of pornography, I'm not doing something evil.
That's correct.
Yeah, I think that's despicable. Yeah.
Really?
Yes, of course.
Who is being hurt? You have to have a victim.
Oh, I'll tell you, there's at least two people being hurt. There's the person who's poisoning himself by encouraging him to think acting out on children, and there's also the animator.
Okay, wait a minute. We both are aching for him not to have those fantasies. I agree with you, but
you won't call it evil.
I won't call a fantasy evil.
Thank you so much for watching that clip. If you want to watch the entire thing, go over to mattfrad.locals.com. Locals is like a non-woke Patreon, so if you want to...
So that's the level here. That's the level of what we're talking about here. Is you can see what you see is the argument that it's a victimless crime, which is a uniquely horrid concept because there are no truly victimless crimes. That's a myth. It's a semantic distinction. So one of the areas in which people say that there are victimless crimes is prostitution. And that is that the prostitute and the John both agree to engage in a commercial transaction for sex in exchange for money. And the issue here is the reality of prostitution is not a bunch of women engaged in voluntary sexual intercourse for money. They're not engaged in sexual intercourse of their own volition. They're engaged in sexual intercourse because they're being pimped out. And for the exceptions to the rule, which is sex by coercion from a pimp to a hooker, the exceptions to the rule are purportedly high-end escorts, but the reality of it is most of those women are engaged in sex for money because of their economic circumstances. And they have one commodity that they know will sell, and that commodity is their sexuality. And some of them are not high-end prostitutes. How oxymoronic is that concept to begin with? The idea that you could be a high-end prostitute, a high-end whore, because you cost more, and therefore you must be higher end than, say, someone who's turning tricks for $20 on the side of a boulevard. The reality of it is the sex industry is rife with abuse. The fact that it's even allowed to exist is a staggering indictment of our culture and its decline in values. That we increasingly are looking at the normalization of prostitution. I saw an article recently in which young girls, 12 years of age, were looking at OnlyFans as a career path going forward when they turn 18. And what you're increasingly seeing is the normalization of pornography, not as something that you watch, but as something that you are directly participating in. And it goes back to this concept of a victimless crime. And so as Dennis Prager and this gentleman have their argument over whether or not animated child pornography is evil, Dennis Prager and even his opponent on the other side of the argument both refer to it as a victimless crime. Well, later, the moderator, this individual, freeze-framed right here, he refers to it as there are two victims. There's the person consuming the pornography and the person who is producing it. And so that's what we're dealing with here. It's not victimless at all. There is some injury that is occurring both on the part of the producer of such material and on the part of the consumer of such material. Now, there isn't an actual physical child being raped as part of this transaction, but as you can imagine, both the producer and the consumer of animated child pornography want to sexually rape a child. And they're using this, according to Dennis Prager, as a means of not doing that. And those of us who have worked in the field of sex trafficking, who have investigated it, who have researched it, know that that is an abject lie. That you could take pornography that's already been produced and make the argument that, well, it's already there, so you might as well use it for some good. And that is giving pedophiles an out where they don't further victimize a child, but they simply watch material that has already been produced that's already there. The truth is, every single time that material is uploaded to the internet and redistributed among pedophiles, the child who is being raped on that film, and that's what it is a rape, the child who is being raped and sexually abused on film is re-victimized because their lowest moment, the moment of their abuse, is being used for sexual gratification by men and women whose appetites are absolutely deplorable. Anyone who views it, anyone who possesses it, anyone who distributes it should be in prison. And you do not have any context in which a child should be re-victimized by the re-showing of their rape or their abuse in any context, including this utilitarian context that Dennis Prager, who is Jewish, by the way, advocates is it's not evil because it doesn't depict an actual rape. It depicts an animated rape. And therefore there are no actual victims. And of course, from a Gentile perspective, that's absolutely untrue. The victims are the producer, the consumer, and also every child that these two, the producer and the consumer, will inevitably target because they aren't working on controlling or eliminating their appetites. They're simply feeding them. And the way that they're feeding them is through animated child pornography or animated child rape. There are certain things that are so abominable and so grotesque that they should not even be depicted And one of those things is the rape of a child. Rape of an adult shouldn't be depicted for entertainment purposes, because it's not entertainment. But according to our film industry and our those who define our culture and its entertainment, it's art, and art imitates life. Well, what I would say to you is we're seeing a situation where art influences life, because art is an art. Art is propaganda, and it is normalizing certain behaviors and certain outlooks and certain values that should not be normalized, that should perpetually and permanently remain on the fringe. And that brings us to our third part of this episode, Gender Then and Now, the Talmudic and the Kabbalistic influence. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the discussions we're having around gender and sex and sexual identity and sexual orientation, whatever that is, trace back to Talmudic and Kabbalistic, therefore Jewish influence, in which these things are defined down and analyzed down to some pretty shocking interpretations of biblical history. So we're all familiar with the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. We're all familiar with the Old Testament. Most of us watching this episode were raised in church, or have at least been to church, and we've been exposed to these stories: Abraham and Sarah, Moses, Joseph, Isaiah. We've been exposed to the ideals and the stories in 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we've been exposed to all of this. We've been exposed to the creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2. But what we haven't been exposed to is the extrapolation of those stories in the Talmud and in the Zohar, the latter of which, the Zohar, is the basis of Jewish mysticism, otherwise known as Kabbalah. And so I want to show you what the Kabbalah actually says about Abraham and Sarah and why they had a child so late in life. This is from the Talmud. The Talmud teaches that Abraham and Sarah were either tumtumen, that is the plural of tumtum, which is they had hidden genitalia that were the cause of their infertility. They had underdeveloped genitalia. So Rabbi Yitzhak said, "For what reason were our forefathers initially infertile?" And Rabbi Ami said, "Abraham and Sarah were originally tumtumen, people whose sexual organs were concealed and not functional. As it is stated, look to the rock from which you were hewn, and to the hole of the pit from which you were dug," in Isaiah 51:1. And it is written in the next verse, "Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you," which indicates that sexual organs were fashioned for them, signified by the words hewn and dug over the course of time. So it took them well into their elderly years to develop their sexual organs, or for their sexual organs, the testes, to descend, for Sarah, for her ovaries to develop. And that was the reason they were infertile, which is directly at odds with the biblical narrative. But this is the explanation given in the Talmud, Yevamot 64a9 through 64b1, as to the cause of Sarah's infertility. And it goes further in the next slide. In Yevamot 64b2, Rav, or Rabbi Naaman, said that Rabbi Bar Ava said, "Our mother Sarah was initially sexually underdeveloped woman, Elonit, which is one of 6 genders in the Talmud. As it is stated, and Sarah was barren, she had no child." So they are expounding on what Genesis 11:30 says. And the superfluous word, "she had no child," indicates that she did not have even a place, for example, a womb for a child. This is their explication of Genesis 11:30. Now, the average Christian is unfamiliar with the fact that this is taught in the Talmud. They're very unfamiliar with what I'm about to show you as it pertains to Adam, which the Talmudic position and, of course, the position of the Zohar, the book that underlies Jewish mysticism, these books say that Adam was born both male and female. He was born a hermaphrodite. And so, in Tazria 11:44, I will make him a help to match him. Bereshit, which is Talmud, I believe, 2:18, or I believe it's in the Zohar, actually. What is to match him? He answers what it means face is facing him, so they will unite face to face. The Holy One, blessed be he, sought him and took the female from him, as it is written, and he took one of his sides. What does one refer to? It resembles the words, my dove, my undefiled is but one, and brought her to the man. It means that he fixed her as a bride and brought her so that she will face him and their faces will shine at each other's. And as long as the woman was joined to his side, the man was alone. Afterwards, the two came out and mated, and 7 emerged, namely Cain with his twin sister, Abel with his 2 twin sisters, which makes 5. Together with Adam and Eve, they were 7. So this is an explication of the creation of man that goes well beyond the biblical version. In the original understanding of Adam and Eve, Adam was born with both a female and a male face, and the female part of Adam was at his back. They were facing in opposite directions, which is why they say in this passage, when they were severed, they would their faces would shine at each other, because then they could be face to face. And it goes further. It says here, since the first man and his mate Eve had sinned against the Holy One, blessed be he, male and female are therefore divided when they emerge from above into this world. The soul of the male is born on his own, and the soul of the female is born on its own, until it will please the Holy One, blessed be he, if man gains merit, to give him his soulmate, that is, the soul of the female that was incorporated in him above. Otherwise she is separated from him and given to another, and then they beget improper children. So the entirety of Kabbalistic aims here is to unite the male and female souls into androgyny. And so when you see this drive driven almost entirely by Jewish social scientists and Jewish thinkers to normalize gender dysphoria into transgenderism and to engage in the surgical augmentation of a male in order to give him female genitalia, and the surgical augmentation of a female to give her a male appearance, it traces back to this. It traces back to the idea that a male and a female are essentially one and the same thing. They're split because of the sin of Adam and Eve, but bringing them back together and transmogrifying them, male into female, female into male, is part of some sort of mystical process. And it's part of something that the average person is not permitted to understand because they are not Jewish. It's something that they are not taught because most of us will never study Kabbalah. Most of us will never pay for Kabbalah lessons or attend a Kabbalah center of any sort. But this is where these ideas originate, is that before they're born, male and female are essentially one, just like Adam and Eve were essentially physically one. The male and the female souls are only divided when they emerge from above into this world. When the soul of the male is born onto its own, and the soul of the female on its own. Now, if the male gains merit, he is united with his soulmate, that is the soul of the female that he was originally incorporated with and united with above. However, if he does not gain merit in the eyes of the Holy One, his soulmate is separated from him and given to another. And then they beget what is called improper children. Goes further, and it gets much more objectionable here in a second. So, the Talmud teaches that Adam was having sex with animals before Eve was given to him as a helpmate. In Yevamot 63a5, it says, "This is now born of my flesh, or my bones and the flesh of my flesh." And this teaches that Adam had intercourse with each animal and beast in his search for his mate. And his mind was not at ease in accordance with the verse, and for Adam there was not found a helpmate for him until he had intercourse with Eve. That's what's taught in the Talmud, in Yevamot 63a5. You can go to Sephariah and look this up for yourself. And you can see Peter Singer, who is a professor at Princeton, infamous, and this is an excerpt from a book review he wrote for a magazine called Nerve. And this is verbatim what he wrote in that book review. But sex with animals does not always involve cruelty. Who has not been at a social occasion disrupted by the household dog ripping the legs of a visitor and vigorously rubbing its penis against them? The host usually discourages such activities, but in private, not everyone objects to being used by her or his dog in this way, and occasionally mutually satisfying activities may develop. Peter Singer is a non-religious Jew, but he would have been exposed to the Talmudic teachings here, which basically normalize the idea that Adam, as a hermaphrodite, the male part of Adam, before Eve was cleaved from him, was having sex with the animals. And he had sex with each animal and beast in search for his mate, and his mind was not at ease, in accordance with the verse. And for Adam there was not found a helpmate for him, in Genesis 2:20, until he had intercourse with Eve. Again, what I have said time and time again, if you want to defeat the enemies of Christianity and the enemies of traditional values, all you have to do is use their own words. All you would have to do when you're talking to Peter Singer is talk about or inquire about the occasionally mutually satisfying activities that may develop if you don't discourage a dog from humping your leg, if you are so inclined towards bestiality or zoophilia, which is the new term that they've tried to impose. But the idea that Adam himself had intercourse with each of the beasts in his search for a helpmate, that is articulated explicitly in the Talmud, in Yevamot 63a5. It goes further. Not only are you dealing with the genders that I've articulated and the implications for Abram and Sarah, let's talk about how Cain was conceived. In Yevamot 103b3, the Talmud and the Midrash teach that the serpent seduced Eve. The Zohar teaches that Eve conceived Cain with the serpent. So as Rabbi Yohanan also said, based on his understanding that the serpent seduced Eve into having sexual relations with him, when the serpent came upon Eve, he infected her with moral contamination, and this contamination remained in all human beings. However, the Jewish people were purified of that religious contamination at Sinai. However, since the Gentiles did not stand with the Jews at Sinai, the moral contamination was not removed from them. And here is Rabbi Eliezer's view on this, which is Samael, that is one of the angels purportedly standing in for the devil, riding on the serpent, came to her, and she conceived. Afterwards Adam came to her, and she conceived Abel. As it is said, and Adam knew Eve his wife. What is the meaning of knew? He knew that she had conceived, and she saw his likeness, that it was not of earthly beings, but of the heavenly beings. And she prophesied and said, I have gotten a man with the Lord. So they're twisting that biblical verse to say that Cain was conceived of Samael riding the serpent. And then Adam later mated with her and conceived Abel. That's one position in the Talmud and the Zohar. However, as you continue with this, you are dealing with a situation in which the story in the Talmud is completely irreconcilable with the biblical story and the conventional understanding of the biblical story. And so as you continue using their own words against them, what you start to see is that their understanding of these verses is vastly different, if not oppositional, to yours as a Christian. That Adam is a hermaphrodite in the Jewish view, that Eve had sex with a serpent or with Samael riding a serpent to conceive Cain, possibly Abel, or Cain and Abel were conceived as twins with two different fathers. Cain had Samael as his father, and Abel had Adam as his father. Cain later murdered Abel. All the generations from Cain were extinguished by the flood because they were so wicked and so evil. And of course, Judaism attributes this to the fact that Eve had an adulterous conception with Samael, or the serpent. Perhaps they're one and the same, perhaps they're two distinct beings, and the serpent is used by Samael to accomplish his views or his aims. And all of this is so far removed from what Christianity teaches as to be utterly beyond comprehension. But as we go back to the original slides here, which is if you take the Nida slides that we went over earlier, you would see that these beliefs extend to normalizing sex with a girl who is 3 years and 1 day old. That is what we're dealing with here. And so when you look at Dennis Prager attempt to defend animated child pornography as essentially victimless and therefore not evil, even though, of course, it involves at least two people who are trying to feed their appetites and their sexual attractions to children through the production of a cartoon that would depict the rape of a child. You have to trace it back to the cultural norms established in Talmudic or rabbinical Judaism, which say that sex with a 3-year and 1 day old girl is appropriate. And that sex with a girl who's younger than that is not that big of a deal. It's akin to putting a finger in the eye. It's a religion and a belief system that teaches that Adam, before Eve was cleaved from him and separated from him, was having sex with the beast and the animals. He had sex with each one of them, despite the fact that in Leviticus such practices are explicitly condemned as the practices that led the land to spew out the previous inhabitants before the Jews took residence there. Before the Israelites came into that land, those practices, bestiality, incest, child prostitution, child sacrifice, these were all the practices that the prior inhabitants of the land engaged in. And wearing that which pertaineth to a woman, if you're a man, and that which pertaineth to a man, if you're a woman, cross-dressing, transgenderism. These are practices that are explicitly condemned in Leviticus 18 through 20 as practices associated with idol worship, the worship of false gods. And yet in the Talmud, the rabbinical teachers are essentially saying that these practices over the first 7 to 10 generations of humanity were normal and were not moral abominations before God. They transform Abram and Sarah into individuals who are basically sexually underdeveloped until a very late age, and that is why they were infertile. That is why Sarah was barren. She was born without a womb, and then she magically got a womb, according to the Talmud. Additionally, Abram did not even have descendant genitalia. The term that is used is tumtumen. And so as we continue through these issues, what you're looking at is the Talmud essentially gives you 6 genders. And it also tells you that Cain was conceived through the sexual intercourse engaged in between Eve and the serpent. It essentially gives you a view of the biblical story around these characters that is far removed from what the Bible says. And when you look at the people in the entertainment industry who are clearly Talmudic Jews, you're looking at a situation where all of these beliefs are then translated into the entertainment and culture and the policy positions that this group of people are trying to impose on the rest of us. Because they also believe the same thing about God, that God is hermaphroditic. And that is something that we will get into in part 2 of this, which will also trace this sort of belief and value system back to the Talmud and the Zohar and Kabbalism, and why these people are doing what they are doing in terms of our culture when it comes to sex and gender identity, or what the title of this episode is, which is Sex and Gender Absurdity and its origins. It originates in Jewish mysticism and Jewish rabbinical teaching. And so as we continue through part 2 of this episode, what you are going to see is these belief systems trace to what you are seeing today in our schools, in our entertainment, and in our popular culture. The idea of multiple genders beyond a male and female binary is not new. It traces back to the Talmud. And so these are the 6 genders: androgynous or intersex, having both male or female, or male and female genitalia; tumtum, or indeterminate gender, that is what they refer to Abraham and Sarah as; alienate, a female who has not shown signs of sexual maturity around 18 or 20 with masculine characteristics; ish or isha, that is male and female, the binary sex and gender. They show sexual characteristics, secondary sexual characteristics, by adolescence, age 12 and a half or 13. And then, of course, you have Saras. That's a male with no signs of sexual maturity by 20. Now, that can be two types. Serous trauma, which is congenital sterility, that is, they are simply born with some sort of congenital defect that affects their fertility. And then, of course, Adam, intentionally created sterility or accidental sterility. And so that is understood traditionally to mean eunuchs. But, of course, in the present paradigm that we all live in, that's also understood to mean transgenderism, because effectively these are Sarah's Adam is being created in our young women, our young boys, and our young girls. It's intentionally created sterility through puberty blockers, and also through surgical augmentation, that is the removal of the uterus and the ovaries. It's the removal of the testes in boys. They are creating Sarah's Adam in this transgender movement. Now, things have since exploded to 80 plus genders. The last I checked, it was 82, according to certain ideological fanatics when it comes to the transgender movement or the LGBTQIA movement. Ultimately, it all traces back to this. These 6 to 8 genders or sexes in the Talmud. That's where this idea originates. And when you read history books and you realize that one of the things that the Nazis targeted in Berlin was Magnus Hirschberg's transgender clinic, the first clinic of its kind, in which he performed, I believe, the first transgender sex reassignment surgery. This was a man who was Jewish, who would have been intimately familiar with these concepts of multiple genders. Now, the way that is depicted on the internet is that the Nazis hated Magnus because of his Jewishness, and that was why they targeted him. But the reality of it was Magnus was singled out because he was playing around with a gender binary that is fundamentally connected to Christian values or traditional values of any type. Sex has always been understood as a binary among traditionally driven societies. And of course, to the extent that there are exceptions to that gender binary, it is understood that these are the results of congenital deformities or developmental delays, so on and so forth. These are defects. These are things that should not be normalized. And the individuals who suffer from these conditions, such as Klinefelter syndrome, should be provided medical and psychological care to help them be restored to some form of normalcy or as close to a normal life as they possibly can experience. And the norm is the gender binary of male and female. That gender binary is connected to a sexual binary, that is, that you're born biologically male or biologically female. That's what you should be, because biologically that is the imperative. But of course, when you go afield of that, what you start having is this explosion of genders, this explosion of sexual perversion, so on and so forth, and you ultimately get a situation where, you have Dennis Prager, a Jew who cannot bring himself to condemn animated child pornography is evil. You have all of these abstractions around issues that are pretty clear. A child cannot consent to sex in any capacity. They lack the cognitive function and capacity to consent to sex, and yet here we are. We're in an age where pedophiles are being reclassified as minor attracted persons. And it would be funny if it weren't so tragic and if it weren't normalizing abuse, but it is. And so as we talk about this, and we are going to talk about it on future live streams and whatnot, as well as future podcasts, we're talking about the normalization of utter and complete depravity and utter and complete abnormality. And that is individuals who are intersex, who are born with both female and male genitalia because of a birth defect, because of some sort of chromosomal or genetic abnormality. Well, it's not that big of a deal. It is a big deal to them. I guarantee you, if they could trade their situation for gender and sex normalcy, which is fitting within the binary, they would. They would not have been born that way if it were up to them. Unfortunately, in our fallen world, these things happen in a world where we have, we have substances in our food supply and in our water supply and in our environment that adversely affect sex development in utero. We know what those substances are: BPAs, PFOAs, so on and so forth. We know that microplastics have a deleterious effect on sex development in utero, and that is one reason why things are the way that they are when it comes to these gender disparity, these gender dysphoria and sex abnormalities. We know what that is. We know what the cause is. We know that impacts sex development in utero in an abnormal and, quite frankly, unhealthy way. And yet we allow these materials to be present in our food storage, our food supply, our water supply, so on and so forth. We know that we know that there are chemical substances out there that have this effect, that disrupt sex hormones. We also have seen a staggering rise that is correlated to the expansion of the vaccine schedule from 6 childhood vaccines in the 80s to over 80 today. And we've seen a relationship between autism and vaccination. We have also seen a relationship between autism and transgenderism. That the overwhelming majority of these individuals who identify as transgender in the news, because of their violent behavior, also were diagnosed as autistic. And so we need to take a long, hard look, not only at our food storage, at any sort of petroleum byproducts in plastics, so on and so forth, and the effect that they're having on our sexual development on our children. We also need to take a look at what vaccination is doing, or what the overwhelming expansion of vaccination is doing in terms of autism, and how that correlates to gender dysphoria and sexual disorders. These are reasonable things to do if you want to be a healthy, well-adjusted society. The reason we have morals and traditions isn't abstract, it's practical. It's because these things are conducive to a good life. And one of the things that we're seeing here is a situation where a lot of us aren't having very good lives. If you want to look at the LGBTQ community, the two things that jump out is that men who have sex with men, that's what the CDC calls it, because they won't call them homosexual or bisexual. They call the men who have sex with men. They account for over 53% of all new HIV diagnoses every year. They account for over 80% of all new syphilis diagnoses. And before anyone says that I'm picking on the LGBTQIA community, the amount of mental health diagnoses in people who are promiscuous, that is anxiety, depression, so on and so forth, widely disparate from people who adapt traditional values and keep to them. And so we have a real problem in our society that traces back to behaviors and choices, some of which the individual makes, and others of which are the product of the environmental factors that I listed earlier, and all of which are driven to normalization by a group of people whose values for over 2,000 years have considered such behaviors normal and have traced those behaviors back to early biblical figures such as Adam and Eve, saying that Adam had sex with all of the beasts and all of the animals before he found his helpmate Eve, saying that Adam was born as a hermaphrodite, male and female. He created them, and the way that they interpret that is to say that Adam was born with two faces, male and female, each facing in opposite directions, and until God cleaved Eve from his back and handed her to him as his helpmate, he was effectively someone who was sexually attracted to animals and engaged in that attraction in his search for his soulmate or his helpmate, Eve. And so God cleaved Eve from the hermaphroditic Adam, divided them, and that way Adam could have a helpmate. He could face her face to face and have intercourse with her, as opposed to having intercourse with animals. That is what they're teaching. That's what we went over in this episode. And so they have kind of an ambivalent attitude towards these behaviors, as Peter Singer, the Jewish philosopher out of Princeton University, wrote in that book review that I cited earlier. They have a very different outlook on this. And that very different outlook is one that is more or less okay with the idea of multiple genders or sexes. It's okay with bestiality. It's okay with sex between a 3-year and 1 day old child and her quote unquote husband who is betrothed to her through sex. These are things that are fundamentally incompatible with the West, fundamentally incompatible and removed from traditional values. And most of us don't want those ideas infecting our children or our schools or our culture or entertainment. We don't even want them hinted at in this respect because we recognize that they're dangerous and they're unhealthy and unproductive. And so one of the things that I've been wrestling with is where ritual abuse originated. Not just in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where I used to be a member, but in the wider world. And as I dug further and further, I started to see that it originated in this. It originated in Jewish rabbinical teaching. It originated in Jewish mysticism and in heretical and, quite frankly, blasphemous interpretations of the Torah and the Old Testament that would classify Adam as a practitioner of bestiality and a hermaphrodite simultaneously, that would say that Abram and Sarah were androgynous or intersex individuals or tum-tum indeterminate gender because they had underdeveloped genitalia. That was the explanation for why they took so long to conceive. I started to see a pattern developing the more I dug into these ideas. And I started to see that what these people are teaching is fundamentally at odds with what the Bible teaches. It relies on a rabbinical interpretation that is so far removed from the source material as to be utterly abominable. So what I'm saying to you is that this is fundamentally incompatible with a Western society that is built on Christian values, and that what I said mockingly in the past, that a Zionist Christian is an oxymoron, that Judeo-Christian is a complete contradiction in terms. This is why. This is absolutely why. And in the current world stage, the events that are taking place, one of the things that I would say to you is we don't have a dog in the fight between Semitic peoples in Israel and Arabia, because make no mistake about it, my position is that there's a lot in the Semitic community as a whole as it pertains to incest, which is still very much normalized culturally and morally among certain communities in the Arabic world, which is why they have overwhelmingly high levels of congenital birth defects and so on and so forth, is because they have no genetic variation, because you have first cousins marrying each other. In the so-called Christian world, you see it in these fundamentalist polygamous groups, such as the Kingstons, who are forcing half-brothers and half-sisters into marriage. And you're seeing Brigham Young, if you dig into it, he actually says that if Mormons don't have other Mormons to marry, they should marry their brothers and their sisters, that's what he's for. That if it comes to it, sibling marriage is permitted to keep Mormonism pure, to keep Mormonism Mormon, to keep from having religious intermarriage. That's the level here, because ultimately what Latter-day Saint belief teaches is that it is the product of Semitic people who came here from Israel, settled in the Americas, and did so at the instruction of God, Heavenly Father. And as you get into the Kabbalah and you start to understand what the Kabbalah teaches about God, that he has a female consort, you start to see the overwhelming similarities between Kabbalism and Mormonism. That's something that I have written about on investigations and ritual abuse, which you can view at https //1830goel.substack.com. You can see the articles that I've written and the argument that I make that Mormonism is just simply Kabbalism reborn for Gentiles. It's a controversial position. It's lost me a fair amount of subscribers and supporters who just do not want to look at the merits of the arguments that I've raised and the source material that I cite. But it is what it is. And one of the things that I would say to you, I'm committed to tracing this back wherever it goes. Political correctness doesn't matter to me. Being popular doesn't matter to me. Telling the truth does. And the truth is that I have a very upset chihuahua that you can see in the background who is demanding my attention. So part one will conclude now. Part two will be up